Hello and welcome back to Get Up and Game. My name is Josh, and in this video I'm going to be ranking all of the villains in Marvel Champions on a scale of Rhino to Ronan. Now, to be clear, I'm not necessarily saying that Rhino is the easiest and Ronan is the hardest, but I think that's the general perception. So that seems like a good enough place to start, and then we'll decide for ourselves if we think that's the case. Now, since this is a ranking, there are of course a few caveats. First of all, this is just my opinion based on my own experiences and kind of how I see things. And second, it can be pretty tricky to rank the villains because your experience can vary pretty wildly depending on what hero you're playing, which aspect you're playing, which modular encounter sets you have included with the villain. So I don't know that we can objectively determine what exact order they all come in, but we should be able to get it relatively close. Now, just to let you know how I'm going to be doing this, I'm approaching this as if we were playing on standard with the modular encounter sets that are recommended with them. And as always, all of my opinions come with a large solo bias, so keep that in mind as well. But I think between expert and multiplayer, the villains will scale accordingly with each other, so I don't think for most of the villains it will make much of a difference whether we were talking about standard and expert or solo and multiplayer. Certainly it will for some, and I'll try to mention that when we come to those. But mainly we're looking at this from a standard perspective if you were playing on solo. All right, that should be enough to get us started. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm just going to grab one. We're going to quickly talk about what I think about the difficulty of that villain. And then I'm going to try to put it in the spot I think it basically goes. And then once we've ranked them all, we're going to determine 4 categories of easy, normal, hard, and very hard. And I think that that'll be a useful way to sort the villains. It doesn't really matter if villain A is 7 villains harder than villain B, but I think thinking of them in terms of about those 4 levels might be a fun and useful way to do it. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. I'm just going to start right in the middle. We'll grab this one, and it is going to be Ebony Maw. This is a really nice one to start with because I think this falls right in about the difficulty I personally like in this game. He's definitely not too easy, but he isn't overly difficult either, and you can approach him pretty much any way you want to with any hero and with just about any deck, and that's sort of how I like to play Marvel Champions. I know some people are really in it for the challenge, and I think that's super cool. For me, I usually just want to sit down and play a quick game, and I don't want to have to build a deck specifically for the villain. And Ebony Maw really kind of represents that difficulty pretty well, I think. So I'm going to put him sort of in the middle. You know, his spells can definitely give you some trouble. And this is definitely one in multiplayer that can cause a lot more problems. If you're playing him 4-player expert, all of the spells start on the table, and then it just gets real kooky from there. But that is a scaling issue. That doesn't so much speak to his difficulty as a villain, so I'm not going to hold that against him. So I think Ebony Maw lands probably right around here or so. So we'll start there, and then as we need to, if I made really bad choices, we can shift things around to try to make it a little bit more accurate. This part's just kind of for fun, an excuse to talk about everybody and to see if I can sort of pinpoint where I think they land. When I do these rankings, I like to come up with a different method each time just to shake things up, and I thought this sounded fun. So next up, we have Kang the Conqueror. Now, he can be pretty tough. He's got a lot going on. He gets bonus attack and bonus threat. Apologies for the glare. I'm trying to avoid it. I had to record this one in a different spot because of how much space I need, and the light is not where I'm used to it. But you have to fight through 3 versions of him, so it makes for a longer game, and he just has many, many opportunities to defeat you. His obligations can really cause you some trouble. He keeps stealing all your best cards or stealing a bunch of your deck. He does a lot of things that can make him pretty tough. I think he's going to end up more along this yellow strip here. Maybe right here. I think Kang is among the harder villains in the game. If this is sort of the middle, he's definitely harder than the very middle villain. So we're going to put Kang right there. I think he can be pretty tough, especially in solo. There's just a lot going on. Next up, we have the Blob, or more specifically, Mansion Attack. Now, I think this one's really tough. I haven't played the Mutant Genesis scenarios as much as I would like. I'll be upfront about that. But this is probably the one I've played the most because I like it the best. And I found this one to be really challenging. Now, there's a lot of variability because there's the 4 different villains and the 4 different main schemes, so depending on which combination you get might work particularly well for your deck, or it might absolutely wreck you, so you're never quite sure. And to be clear, that's the case for all these villains, like just even the easiest ones, that they can have a good game and they can totally destroy you. So you know, like I said at the beginning, it's kind of hard to rank these because you're definitely going to get a different experience each time. This is more just sort of how my gut reacts to when I see them. How hard do I think they are? Most of the time, play these villains 8 times out of 10. They're probably going to give you a similar experience, but those other two, they might either wreck you or be a total pushover. So anyway, I do think Mansion Attack is pretty tough. There's a lot of really mean minions in there. It's just got a lot going on. There's constant effects that are changing the way the game works, and they could particularly work against your deck. So I think they are among the harder, even harder than Kang for sure in my mind. I am going to put the Mansion Attack right here. We're getting towards the top of the yellow strip with them. And that bumps us out to Nebula. Oh, this is the first of our very hard villains. Nebula is really tough. I do like Nebula, but she is just so random. Like, you just never know what you're going to get. She has a lot of surge, but you might get a game with her where you just don't see that much of it, and she actually plays the way I think she was sort of meant to. But the fact that her techniques surge, and she's got quite a few of them in the deck, you're going to see those. And so you're just never quite sure, and it's really hard to keep up with the counters on her ship. You know, she puts a lot of threat on the main scheme. She just gives you so much to deal with. She's not as bad in Standard because at least after she activates, all of her techniques fall off. But if you play her in Expert, I think she's one that's actually significantly harder in Expert. I think most villains scale up at a pretty similar level. Like, everybody's harder on Expert, but they're about the same harder. But some are much harder, and I think Nebula is among the ones that are much harder because the techniques are much harder to get rid of. And she just moves that much faster. So she is the first of our very hard villains, but I think she is the least very hard of the very hard villains. So we are going to put her right there. Next up is Red Skull. This one is a little tricky because depending on if you play him in campaign mode or outside of the campaign, really kind of affects his difficulty. If you play him in the campaign, you've probably experienced him to be pretty easy because you build up your heroes quite a bit over the course of the campaign, and the villains don't get built up quite as much. But if you play him outside of the campaign, I think he's actually one of the harder villains because he has that side scheme deck that's giving him an extra side scheme every round, and it's at the beginning of the round. So if it has a hazard icon, that's going to be yet another extra card you get during the third step of the villain phase, which makes it tough. So he actually gets much harder depending on what modular sets you include. If you include the standard ones with him, which is what we're ranking here, they aren't too bad. And the ones that come with his set actually have beneficial effects much of the time to sort of counteract the fact that he's getting an extra card every time. So if you see those early, those can actually give you a really nice start versus if he comes out with the sleeper and then the crisis one, you know, the ones that don't help you, then you've just got a lot on your plate right from the start. So he gives a pretty variable experience, but I think in general he's pretty tough just because if nothing else, he gets 2 cards a turn every turn. So do I think he's harder than Kang? A little bit. I don't think he's much harder than Kang. That's kind of where my feeling puts him. So we're going to put Red Skull right there. Next we get Magog, one of the newest villains from the Mojo pack. This one's really fun. And here's another wide gulf between Standard and Expert. I think Magog is actually pretty easy-ish on Standard because if you haven't played him, he gets these ratings counters, and you're trying to get more than him. It's basically a race to 10. And in Standard, he only gets 1 at a time, and you get 3 at a time when you do the things he wants you to do. But on Expert, he gets 2 at a time, and you only get 2 at a time, so it closes that gap quite a bit. I think he is much, much harder on Expert than he is on Standard, which makes ranking him slightly difficult. That's why we're just going to focus on Standard, and I'll just mention the Expert ones that I think where that falls in. He's really, really fun, though. And even on Standard, I wouldn't call him quite easy, but I don't think he's too hard. I think he's kind of right in line with Ebony Maw. I think that's where I'm going to put him. A really, really fun scenario. Pretty easy to just grab any deck and play against him if you're playing on Standard. If you're playing on Expert, you have to have a plan. And that's sort of my cutoff for what makes a villain harder is the more you have to prepare ahead of time, the less casual of a deck you can bring is the harder the villain probably is. So after Magog, we're going to go with, Norman Osborn, Risky Business. Now, this is probably the easiest scenario in the game. So I'm actually going to put him in Rhino's spot and shift Rhino down because this is a really cool idea. They gave a villain an alter ego, and he flips back and forth between alter ego and villain the same way the hero does, which is a really neat idea. The problem is there's very little punishment for just keeping him on the Norman Osborn side. And when it's time to win, you can spend all your time building up the whole game. And all he's doing is adding counters to the Criminal Enterprises card. And there's very little punishment for that. Like, you don't really lose anything for doing that. Yeah, you're going to have to spend more damage later in the game getting rid of all those counters, but that's totally fine. You're going to be so built up. And what's meant to make this difficult is when he flips into Green Goblin, he does a big chunk of indirect damage to you, and depending on stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, it just gets more and more. And that can be a problem because he flips back to Norman Osborn pretty easily. So the way it's meant to work is you try to get him to Green Goblin, you take your indirect, and then he's going to flip back to Norman as fast as he can. So you're constantly have to flipping him back to Green Goblin. He, doing the indirect over and over, and it's really hard. But if you just build all the way up, then when you flip him over, you just kill him as fast as you can. Ends up making it too easy. So a cool scenario, but probably the easiest one in the game. So I'm going to swap that with Rhino. So now we can actually talk about Rhino, and I do think Rhino is among the easiest scenarios, but not necessarily the easiest. He's very simple and straightforward, which I think is why they chose him for sort of the intro tutorial scenario. But I kind of wish they hadn't, because I don't think he actually makes for a great experience learning this game compared to how some other villains might have been. He doesn't have complicated mechanisms. Pretty much all he does is attack, boost his attack, and heal. So he's not complicated, but the fact that his main scheme only goes up to 7 teaches new players a bad lesson that you can't ever go to alter ego or you're going to lose the game. I don't like that about him. And the fact that he doesn't even have 2 schemes doesn't teach players what happens when the first scheme runs out. You go to the second one. I've actually seen people ask online because they don't know what happens. They've only played Rhino, and then they go to play Claw, and they're like, okay, now all the threats on the scheme, what am I supposed to do? It doesn't say in the rules. So I think the intro scenario should have had multiple schemes and shouldn't have been so hard to flip down against so that you would learn about using your alter ego actions. That being said, he can give you real trouble because it's so easy to lose that scheme against him, and he does attack frequently and pretty hard. So losing to Rhino is nothing to be ashamed about. We've all lost to Rhino many times. Even on standard, he can definitely give you a game. But that being said, I think he is among the easiest ones, and I think he's probably about the 3rd easiest. So that's where we're going to put Rhino. Next we get Spiral, another very fun Mojo scenario. I think my favorite of the 3. Her gimmick is all about you have this really cool little side deck that you have to shuffle and reveal cards from occasionally. And if you can find a cornered card, it flips her over, and that's when she becomes vulnerable to damage. Otherwise, she's just scheming and putting a bunch of threat on the main scheme, and you can't even remove it when she's in her escaped form. And it makes for a really fun game arc that you're frantically trying to find that cornered card. And then similar to Norman Osborn, she's going to flip back over as fast as she can. So some people might find that annoying. You feel like, oh, I can't ever find that cornered card. But I think they set it up well that you can get it when you need it. Some games it's going to give you more trouble than others, but overall, I think it's just a really fun. The difficulty with rating her, I think, comes from you're going to use 3 of the Mojo modular encounter sets, and depending on which 3 you get, because they're all pretty different, could really interact with your deck in interesting ways. Like the crime one, if that one comes in there and you're not particularly good at thwarting, that can give you so much trouble and make her much, much harder. So there's definitely some variety in her difficulty just based on how well you handle the modular encounter sets. But overall, I don't think she's too hard. In standard, I didn't find her too difficult. In expert, definitely found her much more difficult. I lost to her the one time I have played her in expert, but I did have the game in hand. I just forgot that when she flips to her stage 3, she attacks you, and I wasn't prepared for that. If I hadn't made that mistake, I would have beaten her, and it didn't seem like if she was giving me too much trouble. So all that to say, I think she's a normal difficulty, not too hard. Maybe she's a decent amount harder than Magog, probably. Let's try right here. I think this is a pretty good spot for her. Which gives us, Master Mold. So this is one of the Mutant Genesis scenarios, one of the brand newest ones. And this one has definitely been an interesting one to discuss online because it certainly seems like a lot of people find this one really easy, and I agree. It feels like Master Mold should be really hard. He's this terrifying, gigantic robot. He's got stalwart, so you can't stop him. He's just relentless. But the problem is the scenario just hands you Magneto, who's super good at killing Sentinels, and it just trivializes the whole scenario. So I imagine if you played without Magneto, it'd probably be much more difficult. But he's right there, and you're fully within your rights to use him. So I think it actually makes Master Mold a very easy villain to deal with. Much more so than you would think from the 3rd villain in a campaign box. Yeah, I think the Mutant Genesis difficulty is kind of all over the place in that box, but we could talk about that a different time. For Master Mold, I think he is actually among the easier villains in the game, which was really surprising to me. Probably right about, yeah, maybe even here. Maybe not even the hardest of the easier villains. Which gives us the Tower Defense. I always want to call this one the Two Towers. I almost said that. The Tower Defense. We have Proxima Midnight here. And of course, the whole gimmick with this one is that she's there with her husband Corvus, and you have to reduce both of them to 0 before you can flip them over. And then you're trying to protect Avengers Tower. And that's sort of the problem with the difficulty of this scenario. If you're playing this one in campaign mode, you really need to protect that tower, because if you lose it, it takes 9 damage and flips over. Then that's going to cause you trouble for the rest of the campaign. But if you play it outside of the campaign, which again is what we're ranking here, you can pretty much ignore Avengers Tower and let it take as much damage as you want, because as long as you don't let it go to 18, you're going to be fine. And that makes this scenario so much easier to play, because many of the effects are, you know, put damage on the tower or do this bad thing. Well, I'll just put damage on the tower, no big deal. And the whole gimmick with having to reduce them both to 0 doesn't end up amounting to anything really. They just basically have a combined health pool. I don't think it would have been much different if they hadn't. Now, if I sound down, I don't mean to. I like this scenario. I think it's fun. I just think it's actually really kind of easy. And it's never really given me too much trouble. And this one on Expert, they don't really do anything special on Expert. Their stats just get a little higher, so they're actually among the easiest Expert scenarios, I would say, as well. Do I think they're easier or harder than Master Mold? That's tough to say. I think it's pretty close. I think, you know what? I think they might be just a little bit easier than Master Mold. I think they're in the same general range, though. But that one is a fun one. I do play that one from time to time, but it usually doesn't give me too much trouble. Again, any villain can definitely wreck you anytime, but most of the time I don't think they're too bad. So next we get Drang, the first one from the Galaxy's Most Wanted campaign box, and this is definitely one of my favorite scenarios. I played this in 12 Plays of Christmas because I really enjoy it. It's not particularly challenging, but I do think it's just really fun. He gives you a lot of fun minions to beat up on because he's got the Bane of Badoon in there, and again, we're ranking these based on the recommended modular sets. So there's just a lot of fun things to do. There's a lot of side schemes. It just gives you a lot to handle, but he's not coming at you too hard, and his gimmick of putting the charge-up counters on the ship, that's not overly pressing. Like, you're going to take a couple indirect damage every 2, 3, 4 rounds. Like, it's not that big of a deal. So I think this is one of those that's really good to just play any deck against, because it doesn't do anything weird, or you don't have to prepare in any way, which makes it a little bit on the easier side. Fun, but not too difficult. On Expert, I would say he's probably a little bit harder than your average villain gets on Expert, just because he starts with his spear, and so he's attacking you for 4 right out of the gate, which is pretty scary. So that makes him pretty tough on Expert, but once you get rid of the spear, it's not too bad. I think he is still, I would consider him on the easier side, though. We're going to call him an easy villain. Easy. They're not that easy, just compared to the others. It's all relative. Which leads us to Absorbing Man. I'm just laughing because I feel like I'm getting all the easy ones in a row. I considered making this the easiest one, and you know, it could go either way. There's not that huge of a difference between these, probably. But I think Absorbing Man can give you more trouble than Risky Business, because Risky Business at least has a really exploitable strategy that's pretty easy to take advantage of every time you play it. He doesn't have that so much. He just has a gimmick that's so all over the place that it doesn't often, or at least always, trigger. You know, it's really neat, that idea that he gets the traits from the different environments, and those affect the different cards he plays. You know, they make them worse. They might do more damage, stun you, discard cards, things like that. I really like that gimmick. The problem is, he's got 4 different environments, so the chances of those matching up, they just don't always line up. Now, when his Super Absorbing Power side scheme comes out, gives him all 4 traits, that certainly makes him more interesting. And I've seen a good fix for him online where people say just have that out as a permanent, like he just always has all 4 traits. So that definitely makes him more interesting, but with the recommended modular in there, Hydra Patrol, that's not very scary at all. So I find him to be very easy, but I've seen him beat people. It definitely can happen. But I think most of the time, as long as he's not hitting his traits too often, you're going to be just fine. And he's just not that fun to play either. Like, that's the other thing. If he were harder, he might be a little bit more interesting. But he put a good mod in there, and he'll give you a better time for sure. Which gives us, we are no longer in easy mode, because we have the big purple man himself, Thanos. This This one's such an interesting one, actually, because I don't think Thanos himself is really that hard. If you look at his encounter set, most of his cards don't do that much. They give him an extra boost, or they might put out another Infinity Stone, which that's the problem. It's the Infinity Gauntlet that makes him so hard. You know, he always has it, and so his stats are always increased by 1. So he comes out of the gate attacking for 3 in standard, and it only gets worse from there. And then the Infinity Gauntlet is constantly confusing you, stunning you, adding extra threat. Like, it's just this stifling, oppressive thing, which it should be, but you just feel like, I can't get away from this thing. And that's what makes Thanos hard. If you took the Infinity Gauntlet, his encounter deck isn't that bad, other than the Avatar of Death. That is a really scary card, where he attacks you with piercing and overkill, like you just can't avoid it. You're taking that hit. But I do think he is among the harder villains. I'm going to call him very hard. I think when you come at Thanos, you have to have a plan. His permanent stalwart can be a real problem, because you just can't stop him. Like, there's no avoiding him. I'm glad there's not very many villains that have stalwart permanently on there. As a solo player, I really enjoy Stun and Confuse. They give me a fighting chance against some of these harder villains, but not against Thanos. And even though his main scheme goes all the way up to 12, it feels like it just gets up there so fast, maybe with the Time Stone adding more threat, whatever it is. He can be difficult to go to Alter Ego against. And yeah, he really gives you a lot of trouble. Hits so hard. I think out of all the very hard villains, though, I don't think he's much higher than this. So that leads us to Ultron, the big bad of the core box. Definitely one of my absolute favorite villains. So much fun. I think Ultron does a good job of defining for me what I think a hard villain is. And I kind of said this earlier, but a hard villain is someone that you have to have a plan for. You can't just walk in with any old deck. Like Ultron spitting out those drones, he's got a very specific gimmick, which is fun because you can take advantage of it with certain heroes and do a lot of really cool things. But if you're not prepared for it, you just get swarmed. You have to be able to kill those drones. And there are plenty of ways to do it, but you need to have something. You need to have some Retaliate or a Squirrel Girl, or some way to easily do a whole bunch of small instances of damage, because they just pile up on you. And then as he gets higher up in his stages, you know, he's dealing more damage as a result of all those drones. His scheme can be difficult to keep under control, because the first one only goes up to 3. Thankfully, the second one goes up to like 10, I think. So you've got room there, but you're probably going to end up on the second one if you're not very, very careful. And that one just makes it harder. You're going to be getting even more drones or more threat. He really brings a lot at you. The under attack modular encounter set that he comes with isn't too hard, but it can definitely catch you off guard, especially if it gets that one armor that keeps giving him tough. That can be a real pain. So I do think Ultron's pretty tough. I guess my question I have to ask is, where do I think he's sort of in the lower half of hard. I think I probably would have put him between Kang and Red Skull, but for now we'll put him here. I think he's sort of in this range. And we can sort these out as we go, or maybe at the end, once we've got them all flipped up, we can sort of rearrange, because I do want to have a definitive order. Definitive, but you know what I mean. So, but we'll do that for now. I think that's a pretty good spot for him. Which brings us to the Wrecking Crew. Now, for as much as we talk about these guys online, that usually unfavorably, it seems, I do think this is a really fun scenario. My only problem with this is just not variable. I would play it more if I could shake it up some. And there's lots of house rules and fun ways to do it, so it can be done. But officially, it's the same every time. And it's not bad. It's just, you know, once you've played it 3 or 4 times, you feel like you've seen everything. But I do think they can give you a pretty good challenge. If you don't get under control pretty quickly when all 4 of them are still in play, it's really hard to know what's going to happen, because they have a really cool design with this where you think you know which one is going to be the active one. But there are a lot of boost effects and such that move the active counter from one Wrecking Crew to the other. And so, like, you might think the one you're up against is going to scheme for very little, so you go to Alter Ego, and then it quickly switches to that one, and you're in real trouble. So I think when all 4 of them in play, they provide a pretty solid challenge, and the one that has Retaliate can be a real problem. One hits really hard, and they all have, like, special abilities and stuff, so they're no pushover. I don't think they're overly difficult, but I do think they're probably right about here, kind of right in line with Ebony Maw. Like, they're going to give you a nice challenge. You're probably not going to lose, but you might. And then on Expert, it's just they just have more health, so it's not particularly interesting in Expert. They just takes longer, pretty much. It makes them a little harder, but yeah, I think I'm happy with that spot for the Wrecking Crew. They're okay. Oh, Venom. Now, Venom's pretty tough. I think Venom is one of the harder villains, certainly on Expert. This one's a big jump in Expert. He starts with that side scheme, Tooth and Nail in play, has 8 threat on it. And you do pull threat off of it when you attack and deal damage to Venom, but you don't want to be attacking and dealing damage to Venom. You want to be putting damage on the bell tower. And so it just makes it really, really hard to get rid of that side scheme, and it has a hazard icon. So you're coming out of the gate getting extra encounter cards. On standard, he's definitely quite a bit less difficult. He does have the bell tower mechanic that if you use that wisely, you can avoid his really big attacks. And he can be exploited by using effects like what protection can do with extra damage that isn't considered an attack and things like that. So if you happen to be playing certain kinds of decks against him, he's not very hard really at all. But I think in general, he is decently tough. So I'm definitely going to rank him in the hard. I think he's in a similar spot. In my mind, he's not quite as hard as Mansion Attack, though. But he is a really, really fun scenario. He's got a lot going on. It's fun to try to get the bell tower counters up as high as you can. And then you feel kind of protected for a little while, but he's got a lot of really nasty side schemes and just different. If he does get a big attack on you with all the extra boost cards, like you just don't know what's going to happen because it's probably going to end up with overkill or even indirect. And you're just suddenly, your defense strategy goes right out the window. He can really surprise you, which is really fun. And I do think he's pretty tough. I think you have to have a plan. You kind of have to know what you're doing when you're going in. You have to play him a certain way. And so that's about where I think Venom lands. He's pretty tough. Speaking of pretty tough, how about Magneto? Oh my goodness, this guy is so hard. You know, he's one of those that's just relentless because he has those magnetic counters. They're constantly ticking up. You're getting another counter and another card, and they're really, really nasty cards. They're super mean. And you have to work your way through his side schemes before you can even defeat him. So he requires decent thwarting. Like there are certain heroes that basically probably have no shot at beating Magneto just because they're not good enough in solo to thwart away his side schemes so that you can even finish him off, you know, outside of relying on justice. So he has a very specific way you need to play him. You have to have a plan. And even if you do, he's probably going to beat you. I do think he's a nice difficulty for a boss on standard. Like compared to, say, Ronan, who I do think is harder than Magneto, or some of the other bosses of the boxes, I don't think he's as hard on standard. On expert, he is just about as hard to beat as any of them, I think, because he's hitting harder, he's getting more of those cards. And of course, the expert cards always make every villain harder, so. But ranking him on standard, I think he is definitely among the hardest villains in the game. Maybe right here. I really don't have like a set order for everybody in mind. I just kind of had an idea. But I think he's the top 3 or 4 villains is probably about where I'd put him. Yeah, just a real menace. Which gives us, speaking of menaces, my goodness. Okay, I'm not going to make that segue every time. But Mutagen formula is pretty tough. Now, this was the first product to come out after the core set, so they fully expected you to be able to handle this with core set cards, so it's not overly difficult. And Risky Business was probably easier than anything in the core box, so you had a nice, easy one to play. But this one, I think, was meant to be a challenge, and I think they succeeded. Now, the tricky thing here is I do think on Expert, he is harder than Ultron, but in Standard, I don't think he's nearly as hard in Standard, because on Expert, you know, he starts with the 2 extra encounter cards on stage 2, and then when you go to stage 3, he gets 3 more. So the pressure just never lets up. As soon as you've got this guy under control, he just comes right back, floods the board with more minions. He's just that much more difficult to deal with again. Whereas on Standard, you know, he only brings out the 1 Goblin Thrall, and then that's it. So you've got time to build up. You're not overly pressured at the beginning. He might put some extra threat on the main scheme when he damages you. That's not too bad. So I think Standard Green Goblin versus Standard Ultron, which is, I'm only comparing because Ultron was the boss of the core box and this guy came out next. And I wonder if he was meant to be harder than Ultron. I don't think he is on Standard, but I do think he is on Expert. But we're going on Standard. I do think he's among the harder normal villains, though. Maybe not the hardest. I'm not sure. I don't know who I'm thinking of as the hardest, but I do think he's harder than Spiral and Wrecker for sure. Like, yeah, he's probably in this row somewhere. You know, there's just so many minions. He's got really nasty side schemes. He activates a lot. One thing that does hold him back difficulty-wise, and now that I'm thinking about it, I might shift him down just a smidge, is if you play him with the recommended encounter set, the Goblin Gimmicks, that's actually one of the easiest mod sets in the game. So that kind of you know what? Yeah. I play Green Goblin with other mod sets, or I have for a long time, so I kind of forgot. He's definitely easier with Goblin Gimmicks. I'm going to shift him down to about here. He's one that if you take that Goblin Gimmicks mod set out and replace it with just about anything else, he just instantly gets harder because that set doesn't do too much. But anything that does more than that set does is just going to add that much more to him. So I think it's a pretty good spot. He's definitely challenging. Probably right about the middle difficulty at this point. I think when he came out, he was the hardest scenario, or top 2. But we've just gotten so many hard ones over the last couple of years that he's slipped down some. Or maybe I've just played him a ton. That's certainly, keep in mind, these are all just my opinions based on my experiences. I played a ton of Mutagen formula because it's probably my favorite scenario, or top 2 or 3. So in my mind, I feel like, you know, I know it inside and out, so maybe that's part of it, but that's where I'm at with it anyway. Next week, oh my gosh, the goblins just don't stop. All right, so here's the big question I've been asking myself ever since I decided to do this list. Do I think Venom Goblin is harder than Ronan? Because honestly, this is the one that I think could topple Ronan. And I still haven't made up my mind, and now I'm forced into this position. And I think the way I'm going to approach this, you know, the thing about Venom Goblin, he's got those 3 main schemes, and they're all ticking up, and they all have special abilities. You're moving that glider counter, and you're triggering the special abilities. And he has a really nasty encounter set of his own. There's really, really mean minions in there, and if you do lose one of the main schemes and the symbiote environment becomes a thing, he hits just that much harder, because a lot of the cards trigger off that. Like, there is so much. Venom Goblin is so hard. There's so much you have to keep in mind. He comes with built-in steady, so you can't really slow him down. I mean, you can, but it's a lot harder. The thing that's going to tip the scale for me, I think, is the fact that we're ranking on standard. I think standard Venom Goblin is just slightly easier than standard Ronan, and I think that's where they're going to end up. Only because Venom Goblin on standard, when you move the glider counter, you can choose to put threat on that scheme instead of triggering a special ability. Those special abilities are really debilitating, but you can largely avoid them on standard just by adding more threat. So if you're good at removing threat, and you need to be good at removing threat when you face Venom Goblin, you have to have a plan, and you have to be able to remove threat, because he's got a decent amount of health. He's pretty hard to rush down, and he's got like guard and stuff in his deck. So on standard, he's definitely, you know, doable because of the ability to avoid main schemes, special effects. The other thing that makes Venom Goblin pretty tough most of the time is he does have that Goblin Gear modular encounter set with the advanced glider, and if he gets that, like, it might be game over, because then he's attacking twice or scheming twice, and that advanced glider can be really hard to get rid of. It's not a matter of just paying resources. Like, it's a pretty specific thing you have to do to get rid of it. So I'm almost talking myself into saying he is harder than Ronan, because that Goblin Gear. But the thing is, the rest of the Goblin Gear mod set isn't too bad. The other attachments that can go on him, they're annoying, but they don't even compare to the advanced glider. So if he doesn't get the advanced glider, he's not too bad. If he does get the advanced glider, he's probably worse than Ronan. But on expert, he's like Green Goblin, where he gets extra encounter cards. You start with 2, and then you get 3. And so that's where I think, if we're ranking on expert, I think I would say Venom Goblin is harder. Because Ronan, not that I've ever played him on expert, I'll be honest, but I don't think Ronan gets that much worse in expert compared to the way Venom Goblin does. But we're going on standard, and so I think this is the way I'm going to rank them. So yeah, so we're gonna say that Venom Goblin is just shy of Ronan. So far, Ronan is still the hardest. There might be another contender, though. I've lost my place in where I picked that up, so I'm just going to grab another one from right here, and we'll just keep going. To the Collector, this is the Collector 2, the Escape the Museum, the fun one of the 2 Collector scenarios. And I'm going to be honest, I haven't played this one in a long time, so I'm having a little bit of a hard time remembering how hard I think this is, but he has the Menagerie Medley encounter set, which can be a real pain. You know, the Star Sharks and the Psionic Ghosts are just no fun to deal with. He does have the Galactic Artifacts too, which that's sort of half hard, half easy. But the thing about him, it's so fun, is you're just trying to remove the threat from the main scheme, and then you move on to the next and then the next. And he has the Library Labyrinth that makes that even easier by removing 5 threat for you at the cost of an encounter card. So if you lean into that, you can get the threat off there pretty fast, you know, at the cost of extra encounter cards. You can defeat him, and all that does, I have him covered up. But, you know, his stats go down, makes him a little bit easier for a minute. In my mind, he's not too hard. Especially if you're really good at thwarting, you can just clear the threat off those schemes as fast as you can. You can almost rush him down with thwarting. So I think I'm going to put him in normal somewhere. Do I think he's harder than Ultron? Not in my mind, at least. Like I said, I haven't played him in a while. I do think he's probably harder than your average normal villain. So that's what's tricky about this, too. There's just some villains I haven't played in a while, so I've just got to rely on my gut instinct. My gut instinct is telling me we're going to put him right there. And that's the fun of doing these. You can certainly tell me in the comments where you think I was way off, because there's either my opinions are just wrong or there's probably elements I might have forgotten. But I think that's a pretty good spot for him, which gives us Mysterio. I feel like I've been playing a lot of Mysterio lately. He's shown up on my channel a few times in the last couple months. He's just so fun. The whole gimmick of shuffling things into your deck is just a good time. It's really different. Nobody else is really doing that, other than Mystique, I guess. And the way they sort of balance his difficulty is his encounter cards usually aren't too bad, but you're going to have a lot of them because they're getting shuffled into your deck and they're spitting out. So you might have 2, 3, 4 to resolve. And individually, they probably aren't doing too much to you. But, you know, there's just so many different things happening. It's almost hard to keep up with. And I think he's really fun, but I don't think he's very hard. I think he is probably one of the lower difficulties. Certainly on standard, he has very little health. He only has 15 and then I think 16 or maybe 17. So you can rush him down if you really want to. And if you do beat him down quickly and he doesn't have opportunities to shuffle cards into your deck, you're really going to be in good shape. Like, that's the one thing about Mysterio. It can be pretty hit or miss about whether or not he shuffles cards into your deck. And if he's not doing that, he's really not doing too much. Especially with his recommended mod, it's not too hard. So we're going to call him easy. Do I think he's easier than Spiral? I do, actually. I probably think he's easier than the Wrecking Crew. Magog, though, I think he's kind of right around. We'll say he's right around here. I think that's a good spot for him. He might be a little bit easier than that, but that should be pretty close. And now we have who I always say is my favorite villain. Not 100% sure if that's true. Every time I look at Green Goblin, I just think a little bit higher of him, but Hela's definitely up there for me. It's just the journey is so fun. You have to take out that first big minion, clear that side scheme, and then you're on to the next level and the next level, and then finally you're down where Odin is, you rescue him, and then you can fight Hela. It's really fun. You know, she gets stronger over the course of that game. I personally love the Asgard flavor, so I'm a big fan of this scenario, but I don't think it's terribly difficult. I think it's meant to be. You know, it's the 4th scenario in the Mad Titan Shadow, so I think it's supposed to be hard, but I've never really found it to be very, very difficult, partially because you can just park yourself on that first sort of ring of the story, kind of like how you can with Risky Business. I don't personally like doing that. I think it's more fun if you push forward, but that is an exploitable strategy that's perfectly accessible to be used, and it really, really cuts down the difficulty of her. And we have to rank her based on how you can play, not how I think maybe we should play, just because I think it's more fun to push her, because then she gets strong and can you keep up with her. But if you just stay, you take out that first minion, you take out Garm, that side scheme is just an acceleration, so that's not really doing anything. And then you just stay there, you build up for 3 or 4 turns, and then you start pushing her, makes it kind of easy. So really, really fun, really cool, love the flavor, but I don't think it's as hard as it was meant to be. So we're going to put her right there, leading us to Sandman. Man, there are so many great villains in this game, because I almost caught myself saying one of my favorite scenarios, and it is, but I don't want to repeat myself too much in this video, but he is so much fun. He has that sand, the city streets that you have to manage the sand on. You've got to have a plan for keeping those counters down, and that's really where all his difficulty comes from. If you can manage those sand counters, he's actually pretty easy. He's not hitting too hard, and it's indirect, so you can spread it around if you bring a lot of allies. Like, you could really tech a deck against him really just by bringing a bunch of allies. If you have one high attack ally, they can just keep that city streets clear every turn, and then he's not doing too much. But I do think he does a pretty good job of building that city streets up. He has a lot of effects that add counters to it, so you have to stay on it, and I think he makes it a challenge. But if you are able to stay on it, which should be your plan, then I don't think he's too hard. Now, where he lands on the spots that I have left here, I don't know that I think he's the easiest one. But I don't know if I think he's harder than Spiral. You know what? No, because he's definitely not on par with Green Goblin, I don't think. I think he should probably be maybe sort of Ebony Maw Wrecking Crew area. So we're just gonna shift some things a little bit, get him. I think that's a good spot for him. So not too far off. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Sandman. Super fun. Definitely a little harder in expert. You know, he's going to hit harder, and then he gets stage 3. He starts doing overkill instead of indirect, so you can't chump block anymore. He's more likely to damage you, which means he's more likely to hit the city streets. So definitely gets a little bit more challenging, but still not too bad. Really, really fun, though, and a great opening to that box. You know, the first scenarios of the box shouldn't be too hard, right? And most of them aren't. I was really hoping I'd flip over Sabertooth. That would have been perfect, because Sabertooth is way too hard for the first scenario in a box, but I guess we'll talk about him later. The Claw. Now, the Claw, I think, is pretty darn tough. If Hela isn't as hard as I think she's meant to be, I think Claw is harder than he's supposed to be. You know, he's the second villain in the core set. You've just finally sort of figured out the game. You've beaten Rhino, and you're ready to try out Claw, and I think he just wrecks people. He has so many annoying effects, and he's just so swingy. You know, he can attack for 0, he can attack for 6. Like, you just don't know what you're going to get. Makes it difficult to prepare for, makes it difficult to defend his attacks. And he's got, you know, exhausting. He's got those Masters of Evil in there. They all have bad boost effects. He's exhausting you. They're stunning you. They're doing all this extra damage. They themselves, those minions, are definitely no pushovers. There are a lot to deal with. And he's got cards like Sonic Boom that cause you to spend a bunch of resources or exhaust all of your characters. He's got attachments that are really costly to get rid of, and you want to get rid of them because they cause retaliate or stun. Like, he brings so much to the table, which I think is good. I think he's a really good villain. I just find him surprisingly difficult for sort of where they positioned him. And I know I said that I thought Green Goblin was kind of right around Ultron, but the more I think about it, I think Claw is actually harder than Green Goblin. And I'm still very much questioning my Collector. You know, I'm giving him the Collector spot, actually. I think Claw is harder than Collector. I think Collector probably belongs down here the more I think about it. So we're going to switch them there. I think Claw can really give you a hard time. And maybe I'm overstating his difficulty, but I've played him recently, and I felt like he was still giving me all kinds of trouble. So I think Claw isn't that far off from Ultron. I like that spot for him. Now, Mojo, here is the boss of the most recent scenario pack, and this is another one of those that scales way up on Expert. I've played him on Standard a few times. I played him on Expert a couple times, and he completely wrecked me in Expert because he's trying to flip cards off his deck to put threat on your characters, and then if they die or flip over, the threat goes on the main. And even though the main scheme goes up to 25, there's just threat everywhere wanting to come on that. But that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is just he's flipping so many cards off of his deck every turn. And when he gets through his deck, you shuffle in a new mod set, and then you reveal a bunch of extra cards from that new mod set. And then solo, you only get to go through the deck twice. And it is very, very easy to do that. Plus, just you have to be very careful when he flips. When he does flip over that deck, like I said, he spits out a bunch of extra encounter cards. And depending on which mod set it is, you know, if it's sci-fi or horror with just a really scary minions, like you just get swarmed out of nowhere. Now, on Standard, he's not as bad, but in Expert, he's flipping 4 cards and then 5 cards. Like, he just chews through his deck so quickly. He's so hard. And I can't even imagine a multiplayer because he's doing that per player. Like, you get more trips through the deck the more players there are, but still, he flips so many. I don't think it would probably even keep up. I haven't tried him past 1 player, though, and he's hard enough there for me. But I do really like it. It's definitely a very different scenario. And it throws a lot at you depending on which of the modular encounter sets get shuffled in. You know, the Mojo ones are all so variable because there's the 6 different sets, and they're all pretty different. There's about 3, you know, minion-based ones, and then 3 that kind of go in a different direction. And so depending on what mix you get of that, just really changes things up. So, but I do think he's pretty tough. Now, on Standard, I feel like I haven't played him enough to really know for sure. In my brain, between Red Skull and Venom might be an okay spot. Maybe he's not quite that difficult on Standard. I could be wrong. But I don't think we need to shift things. I think he's pretty good. Either way, I think he is among the hard villains. Like, I think he's harder than what we've seen up here so far. So that's where I'm going with Mojo. Really, really cool. And I think they did a good job. We've seen all 3 of them now. The difficulty on those, I think, scales so well. Like, you can play those really casually on Standard and have a really good time, and it's just fun but not overly difficult. But if you want a challenge, you go to Expert. They all shoot straight up. I think all 3 of them are significantly like harder than most villains get from Standard to Expert. And I imagine that must have been deliberate because it sure feels that way. And I think that's a good way to do it. Scale low and then go high. I like that better because there's many other ways to tweak the difficulty as well. So why not start nice and easy and then let us make it harder? And I hope going forward, this is the most recent product we've seen. I hope going forward that's sort of the new design philosophy is let's go ahead and let them be pretty easy and then let the players make them harder, because there's not very many ways to make them easier. Oh, speaking of Loki, just seeing this guy just made me die a little inside. This is not a scenario I enjoy. You want to talk about annoying effects? I talked about with Claw. If we're talking about the recommended modulars, there is no more annoying way to play this game than to have the Enchantress shuffled into your encounter deck. And he comes with her standards, so if that's how we're ranking him, that's what we got to talk about. And of course, he also has the Infinity Gauntlet, so it's just a double whammy of annoying effects. Like, Loki is just constantly irritating you. He's switching in and out. You don't know which one you're going to get. His encounter cards can be really, really bad. He gets a lot of extra activations, and definitely a big jump from standard to expert just because he gets so much more health. You got to defeat 3 of them, so he goes to 60 health. Is a lot in solo. That is a lot of health to chew through. So I guess now the question is, where do I think he falls? Magneto, Venom, Goblin, Ronan. I do think he's harder than Magneto, if nothing else, for the Infinity Gauntlet. If it wasn't for the Infinity Gauntlet, I don't think his set, apart from the cards that interact with the Gauntlet, are as bad as Magneto's cards. But that Gauntlet is just so difficult. It adds so much to any scenario. It just brings all the extra status effects, all the extra threat. You're always getting minions. That's another thing that makes it kind of rough with Loki. He's got the Space Stone. He's hardly got any minions in his deck. And the ones he does have, you don't want to see. It's going to bring out Enchantress. It's going to bring out a Frost Giant or Laufey. Like, you don't want to be seeing those guys. But it's probably going to get through half the encounter deck before it finds one. So that's kind of a problem. That's why when I play Loki and when I have fun, I take Enchantress out and I put a heavier minion set in there. We have 5, 6, 7 minions. That way the Space Stone actually has something to find. I think that's a much more fun way to play him. But ranking him here, I don't think he's as hard as Venom Goblin. I think I left the right spot open for him. I hadn't made up my mind yet. But the more I talked about Venom Goblin, really reminded me of how hard I think he is. And I haven't played Loki a ton just because I do find him kind of annoying. But in my mind, I remember being really hard. He just gives you so much to deal with. And so I think these are how the 4 hardest villains are going to shake out. I'm pretty sure we're going to leave those like that. Getting us to Collector 1, probably my least favorite scenario in the game to play, based on the mechanisms anyway, not so much the difficulty, but just because of how it scales in solo. All the cards that leave play go to the collection, and in solo you only have room for 5, and you can only remove 1 per turn. That right there is a problem enough, but he has lots of effects that can cause cards to be added to the collection. There's not much you can do about it. His boost effect on his first attack could cause a card to go to the collection. I'm pretty sure 1 starts in play, at least it does on expert. And then his encounter card might make something leave play as well, and before you know it, there's already 3 cards in the collection. You can only remove 1. Like, it happens so fast, and you're spending all of your resources just trying to keep cards out of the collection. Meanwhile, he's got the Menagerie Medley coming at you, and all of his he's got some nasty encounter cards of his own. So I do think he is a real pain, but mostly because of the scaling of the collection. I imagine it's probably just as bad in multiplayer. I'm not sure. I don't think I've ever played him past 1, but 1 player, I think that's too low. I think it should be at least 7, or let you remove 2 cards per turn or something. I do think he is probably a hard villain, again, less because of how he works, but just because of the way the collection is scaled. I don't know that he is just shy of the hardest hard villains, though. So I think I do need to slide things down just a bit. I feel like right around Red Skull Mojo is a good spot for him, because it's not going to feel like he's harder than them when you're playing them, I don't think, but then you're suddenly going to lose, and you're like, what did I do? How did I lose all of a sudden? I wasn't having any trouble, and now the game's over because I've lost. So it's hard in that way, which isn't really fun. So that's where we're going to put him. I think he's in the same line. I think you'll lose to Collector more than you'll lose to Red Skull, but you'll have a better time fighting Red Skull. There's Sabertooth. Now this guy is really tough. He's kind of like Rhino, where he's just constantly attacking you. He has a bunch of extra activations, and you have to be very careful to protect Robert Kelly, because it's very easy to lose him and lose the game. And then you've got Mystique messing with your deck, causing you to discard things. Yeah, Sabertooth is really, really hard. And I'm just surprised at how difficulty is for the first scenario in a box. Now, like I said, I haven't played the Mutant Genesis ones enough to know, so maybe it was just my initial impressions with them, and if I just didn't play him with a good strategy, or I wasn't using a right hero, but he really struck me as quite difficult, and I've seen other people say that online as well, so I don't think it's just me. You know, especially if you're a newer player and you're jumping into this game because you like the X-Men, you run into this thing first thing and you're like, oh, this game is really hard. And then when you play the next couple scenarios, it's not nearly as bad. Like, I think he should have been the 4th or 5th scenario. So I do think he's pretty tough. The problem is, I do think he is among the hard villains. I don't know if I think he's the hardest of the hard, though. But that's the only spot I have left. So just for the sake of discussion, because these colors don't necessarily mean anything right now, we're going to rank them by difficulty officially at the end. We're going to move Ultron down here. I do think he's probably would be considered hard, though. And then let's put Sabertooth. I definitely feel like it's harder than Mojo. I feel like Venom, Mansion Attack, yeah. Like, he is right there with Mansion Attack. And this is the 4th scenario. So I think that's where we're going to put Sabertooth. He's definitely really, really tough. Now, maybe if I played him a few more times, my opinion would soften a bit, but that's where I'm at. So we'll just pick this one up next, and we get Zola. And Zola, that's funny, just happened to be in the spot that I am going to put him, because I don't think he quite ranks with the very hard villains. You know, when I think of who I really don't feel like playing against because they're just really, really hard, Zola doesn't really come to mind. I enjoy Zola. I'll play Zola, and I don't think it requires too much forward planning, but you definitely have to have a strong deck because he's got a lot of really mean minions that only get stronger, and he has built-in retaliate, which that is a real thing you have to deal with. And there are ways to deal with it. You can come at him with a bunch of overkill damage, or similar to Venom, he is susceptible to things that protection can do. So there are ways to deal with him, but you kind of have to have those ways. You don't just want to keep attacking him. He's going to eat your allies alive. And he'll chew you down too if you just keep basic attacking him. So you definitely have to have a plan for Zola. And I really do think he is probably the hardest villain leading into the very, very hard villains. So that is where we're going to put him. So I picked him up, I put him right back down, so now I need a new spot. And we're going to go with Sentinel. These guys aren't too bad, I don't think. You know, you get a lot of minions, which are really, really fun to fight against. This one's kind of like Taskmaster, where you get the free allies that you can rescue with the side schemes, which is really fun. And that can affect the difficulty. We haven't talked about Taskmaster yet, but I'm going to say a similar thing there. You know, anytime a scenario is giving you free stuff, that definitely makes it a little bit easier. And they don't really scale these up to compensate, I don't think. If you're able to get those allies and you're able to clear those side schemes, that's definitely going to go a long way towards helping you win. This does have the Operation Zero Tolerance side scheme, which prevents chump blocking, which is really nice. I don't mind chump blocking as a strategy, but I know a lot of people do. And it's nice that they address that in different ways sometimes. And so that one makes this interesting. You have to have a plan. You have to know what you're doing. As far as where I think it ranks, you know, for everything I said about how hard Claw is, I think he's harder than Claw. I think Sentinel goes right about here. Kind of a similar experience with Goblin. You get a lot of minions to fight. And maybe it's a little harder. I don't know. I think they're probably pretty close. I mean, how big of a difference is there between all of these villains, right? They've done a good job of kind of having them in line. So that is going to bring us to, we're getting close here, the Hood. Now, this one is like impossible to rank because how hard the Hood is largely depends on which modular encounter sets he has. But as far as his encounter set goes, I think he can be pretty tough. He has a lot of Surge. You know, with that foul play, it's basically Surge. You know, he gets extra activations, a decent amount. And then if he does have harder modular encounter sets, and I think most of them are, you know, not too easy. So even if he has a couple easy ones, most of them are probably going to be at least decently challenging. And he's really hard to prepare for because you don't know what you're going to be facing. So all in all, I think a good place for the Hood is probably right in the middle. I think the Hood is probably the prime meridian of Marvel Champions villains. He could kind of go either way. He's definitely pretty challenging though, and he is one that I think scales quite a bit up on Expert because of how the foul play works. It's far more likely to trigger an Expert, so you're going to be getting a lot more encounter cards. So yeah, I like the Hood right in the middle. I think that is a good spot for him. A really, really fun scenario. And it could kind of go up, it could go down depending on what the mod sets are. which leads us to the Sinister Six. And this is one that keeps falling in my estimation. I think it's really, really fun to play. I just feel like it should be harder than it is. This one's kind of similar to Hela. You know, it's the fourth one in the box. It feels like it's meant to be a real challenge. Out comes the Sinister Six in this ambush. And as long as you can do a decent job of keeping them off the board, you know, they're basically all just big minions, and you knock them out and they go away for a while. And then you remove threat from that side scheme. I just don't think they present that much of a challenge. They all have a special ability, but they have to actually damage you to trigger that, so there's lots of ways to avoid that. And so they're just very manageable. Now, I know that they can get out of hand, and the way they're supposed to work is if there's 3 or 4 of them in play, their cards really, really are very potent. Their encounter cards are going to add a bunch of threat. They're going to attack you really, really hard. And I've seen that happen, and it can. But I think more often than not, you're just knocking these guys out one after another. And then, you know, there's not that much coming at you. It's not variable, but the mod set that's in there isn't that difficult. It's not easy, but, you know, there would be ways to make this harder if you could mod it, but you're technically not supposed to. So I think this one isn't easy. I just think it's easier than it should be. The problem is the only spots I have left they're definitely not that easy, and I don't think they're this hard. I mean, they can be. That's the thing, right? Once in a while, they're going to give you that kind of challenge. But I think they probably belong more down around Collector Green. I feel like I've shifted this row back and forth multiple times. But, you know, it's tougher. You're right in the middle, right? It's really hard to determine how much harder Spiral is than Collector. So I am going to give them... I think Goblin is harder than the Sinister Six. So I think we're going to put them right there. Certainly not among the easiest scenarios, but I wish it was a little bit more challenging. Really felt like they were a real threat. All of them stayed on the board and really came at you a lot. And that hasn't been my experience, at least. So, all right, we just have a couple more. We're almost done. There we go. There's Tasky. I was just talking about him. Very similar to the Sentinel. You get those free heroes for hire, and this one's even more egregious about it because they're free. And if you pay a special resource, a certain resource when they come into play, they give you an awesome, like super powerful effect. So if you're decent at thwarting and you get a hold of those capture by Hydra side schemes, you can really, really mess up Taskmaster's day, because you're just getting so much free power to use against him, which is fun, and it's really nice in the campaign. It sets you up for the next couple scenarios. But outside of the campaign, I think it's even easier. I wouldn't quite call it an exploitable strategy because it's just baked right into the scenario, but it's not too tough. Now, if you watch my channel, you watch my playthroughs, I have lost to Taskmaster a couple times. Playing him in aggression, I couldn't clear the side scheme, so I didn't get the benefit of the free allies, and I found him pretty challenging. But in general, I don't think he's terribly difficult. And we've only got one spot left to open on the board, and I wouldn't put him in that spot. I think what I'm going to do is I think he is more... Man, these middle ones are just hard to rank because they're all so similar, right? I'm thinking kind of right in here-ish. Man, maybe he's a little easier than Sandman. So we'll just kind of put him there. And that leaves who for the final? We get a Crossbones. Definitely one I've played many times, have enjoyed. This is actually the one that I kind of wish was the intro scenario. I think this one provides a really, really good learning experience. There's a bunch of main schemes. If you're losing the threat, you can kind of see how that works. He provides a good challenge, but it's not overly variable. Like, you kind of know what you're getting with Crossbones. You know, Rhino can just go off sometimes and attack you over and over, and you're just dead. Now, Crossbones does have some scary cards for sure. He's got the full auto that if he has a weapon or two on him, that could pretty much end the game. So there's some variability there for sure, but overall, I think this is a really good intro scenario, and I do think he's pretty easy. In fact, the spot I flipped him, and again, when I say easy, I don't mean like easy, just, you know, easier than most of the other villains. I think where I flipped him is where I want him. The only thing that kind of holds me back and makes me want to make him a little bit harder, and I think I might, is he does have the Legions of Hydra modular encounter set, and if that comes out, that ratchets up Crossbones like 2 or 3 times. Like, that mod set, when you have a Hydra villain, just makes it so much harder. And so I think your difficulty with Crossbones largely is determined by whether or not you saw the Legions of Hydra, and if you did, you probably had a really hard time or maybe even lost. But if he didn't get them out, then I think you can handle him pretty well. He doesn't have a ton of health, so it's not easy to just kind of beat down quickly. And if you can keep his weapons off of him, he's not hitting that hard. I do think he is You know, just for the legions, I'm going to say he's a little bit higher than tower defense, but I think he is kind of in that top row. So there's where we ended up with, and I think we got it pretty close to where I want it. So then I guess the last one is I never really talked about Ronan, and I don't have a ton of experience with Ronan because I got beat by him a whole bunch of times real bad right when Galaxy's Most Wanted came out. And I just haven't gotten around to going back and fighting him since then, though I have watched many, many playthroughs online. There are some people who sort of make it their job to fight Ronan and show us that he can be beat. Descry Gaming is one. If you haven't seen him, I definitely recommend his channel. He actually recently did a ranking of all the villains on Expert, and he really knows his stuff. So if you want to see how he thinks things shake out on Expert, I'll leave a link to his video in the description. And he's fought Ronan. I've seen him beat Ronan so many times on Expert in solo with so many different heroes. So I know it can be done. I just haven't got around to going back and doing it myself. But the thing about Ronan is he is just relentless. He gets so many encounter cards, and everything is tuned up with him. His stats are high. You know, he gets the universal weapon to start, which gives him +1/+1 in Stalwart. You got to get rid of that, and that's just going to come right back out as a boost effect. He gets a lot of free encounter cards. He's got a lot of Surge on cards that shouldn't have Surge. He's got the Kree Militants in there, which is some of the nastiest heavy minions in the game. Just everything about Ronan is just tuned to the nines. The one saving grace is he does have the ship command, so you get the Milano, and so you can cancel one of the encounter cards that are coming at you every turn, but that's another resource you have to spend, and you kind of have to pick and choose, try to find the best target, and that's, I think, probably the strategy for beating him. You either rush him down as fast as you can with like Hulk or Star-Lord, but that's, you know, whatever. You can do that with anybody. But if you really want to game with him, you really have to be careful with how you use the Milano, and you cancel the right encounter cards, and then, you know, hopefully it doesn't come at you too bad. But there is just so much coming at him, and all the numbers are just higher than everybody else. Like his side schemes have too much threat, his attacks are too hard, and it just doesn't stop with him. So I think on standard, he is the hardest villain still, or at least he is in my mind. And I should probably get around to playing him again sometime soon and maybe getting a win finally. But at least I've beaten Venom Goblin on standard. So yeah, so I think that's a good spot. Let's now break them into their difficulties and see if I got them all in the right spot. So we're going to go with this as the very hard villains. And I do like this order. You know, that one wasn't too hard because there's only a few, and I kind of already knew where I wanted these. So yeah, Nebula, I would consider very hard. You're going to lose more often than you win. It's less about her gimmick and more just about all the Surge and how random it can be. And then I didn't mention it, but she also has the Space Pirates mod set, which is really, really tough too. I'm tempted to say that she's harder than Thanos. Actually, you know what? I think I will. I think Thanos gives you a more consistent experience. His mod sets aren't too bad, and most of his cards aren't too bad. So it's really the Infinity Gauntlet that cause it his most problems, and of course he just hits so hard. But I think, now that I'm talking about this more, I think Thanos is the least hard of what I would still consider very hard. Somebody I'm not personally looking to play all that often, just because I like sort of things in this sort of middle, maybe the higher to hard range is kind of where I like to fall. So, but yeah, Thanos, and then, yeah, like so I said, Nebula's just all over the place. Magneto, Loki, Venom, Goblin, I don't think there's that much that separates these. They're all just really hard, right? They're meant to be, and I think they are. They did a good job. And then I think Ronan does just sort of stand head and shoulders above. You know, I said on Expert, these might be switched, but in my mind, he still is just so terrifying, and it's just going to kill you on the first turn. I've seen it happen so many times. So I think we're going to call that the very hard villains. And then hard, definitely, I just want to kind of look at the order here. I think the one that really throws me off here is Collector 1. You know what? And Mojo, actually. I think they're probably... I'm giving Collector 1 too much credit, really, but it's just because of the stupid collection and how it works. We're going to put him down there. If you can manage the collection, he's really not that hard, but it's still, you know, tough. So I think this is how I like for the hard villains, except I do want to count Ultron in with the hard as well. I almost want to put Mojo under Ultron, but if you can manage the drones, he's not too bad. There's really nothing you can do to stop Mojo. So I do like this order for the hard villains. You don't necessarily have to have a plan for all of these villains, but you have to have at least an idea of what you're doing, and you have to have pretty solid decks. Like, you're not just going to roll into these with your average pre-con and win more than you lose. Like, these are all going to give you a lot of trouble. I think this is a really, really good difficulty. I'm not saying these are too hard, like they shouldn't be this hard, but these are like, for me, these are like special challenges. Like, you got to build a deck. You're going to see if you can finally beat this such and such very hard villain. I think these you can definitely just grab and play, but you want to make sure you have a good deck to face them with and kind of know what you're getting into. And I do think Zola is the hardest of the hard villains. And then we've just got this giant swath of villains on normal, which is probably what you want. You know, there's a large variety of players with different preferences. You want to have a lot of villains that are going to provide a nice balanced difficulty, and I think that's where these all lie. And as far as the order, I'm not even going to worry too much about trying to sort them into absolutely perfect, because I think this is pretty close. It's really hard to say. Let me get them all scooped up, and then we'll kind of see where we like them all. So as far as the normal difficulty, do I think Magog is the easiest among these? I do, actually. Ebony Maw, Taskmaster, Sandman, the Wrecking Crew. Maybe the Wrecking Crew is a little bit easier than some of these guys. I don't know. They can get you. I do think Mysterio might actually be easier than Sandman, though. Hela, Spiral. Collector 2, this one, like, I feel like I can't remember anything about this scenario other than I think it's fun, but I'm really struggling to remember how hard I think it is. So we're going to leave that there, I guess. I always try to be honest about these things. Sinister Six, I am tempted to push that down further. But I guess not. I guess that's an okay place for it. Mutagen might be a little harder than Sentinel. Yeah, let's do that. The Hood and then Claw. So the Hood's kind of the middle. Everything is sort of on the easier side of the game maybe before the Hood, which now that I say that, looking at Green Goblin, I don't feel like he should be the easier, you know. We're going to do that. I think Green Goblin's probably a little bit harder than the Hood. And then I do think Claw is sort of the hardest of the normal villains. He's the boss of the normal villains. Stacked these wrong. So we've got that. And then as far as quote-unquote easy goes, Risky Business being the easiest one, I agree with that. Yeah, Absorbing Man, second. Rhino, Tower Defense, Crossbones, Master. Yeah, I'm pleased with this ranking for the easy ones. And so I think there we have our order. So ranking all the villains on a scale of Rhino to Ronan actually lands us on Risky Business to Ronan. But Rhino's not too far off. And what we have here is just such an impressive collection of well-designed villains. Like, there are only 2 or 3 that I genuinely just never want to play, either because they're just harder than I'm looking for, or the collector is just kind of a hassle to deal with. But all of these are just so varied and so fun and so well done. And it's good that we have such a large range, you know, from Risky Business to Ronan. That is a very significant gap in difficulty, which means you just have such a nice selection of difficulty to choose from. And of course, the type of deck you're playing, the hero, the aspect, the mod sets, like all of this can be so adjusted that you could make Risky Business, I don't know, you probably can't make him as hard as Ronan, but you could definitely get him much, much higher up here. And, you know, if you like the mechanisms and you just want more of a challenge, there are ways to do that. So just so well done. Love these villains. Love this game. I thank you so much for joining me for this. This was really fun to just kind of have an excuse to talk about everybody and to maybe somewhat accurately put them in a certain order. I don't know if that's useful at all, but it was fun to do. So thank you so much. And if you did enjoy the video, I ask if you'd give it a like. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I've got plenty of other rankings, lots of playthroughs, and I have lots and lots more Marvel Champions content coming up. So if that's your thing, go ahead and subscribe and follow along. And I look forward to seeing you next time we get up in game. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.